If if you want to, If you want to grab a seat, we'll be getting started very soon. Hello. If everyone wants to grab a seat, we're going to get started. My name is Rebecca West. I am the publisher of the Montreal Review of Books. I'm so glad to see so many of you here in this beautiful, not too hot venue on a hot, hot day. Welcome to the launch of the summer issue, number 74 of the Montreal Review of Books. As I mentioned, Rebecca West, publisher of the MRB and executive director of our parent organization, the Association of English Language Publishers of Quebec. It's so nice to see so many of you here. Thank you for coming out to support our wonderful, talented authors, and hello to anyone tuning in online. As the publisher of the MRB, and on a more personal note, as a white settler with ancestral roots in the Netherlands and Ireland, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered in a place known as Jojage in the Ganyahaga language and Muniang in the language of the Anishinaabe. Our association represents a diverse community who live and work on the territories of many Indigenous peoples, including the Ganyahaga, Abenaki, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat. As a publication celebrating local books, we acknowledge the first storytellers of these lands. I'd like to thank our amazing, dedicated Montreal Review of Books staff for putting this great issue together, our editor, Malcolm Fraser, associate editor, Nived Damaraj, associate publisher, Alexandra Swenny, graphic designer, David Leblanc, our national ad sales manager, Michael Weil. Hello, if you're online. All of our reviewers and illustrators, Peter Krause, who's here with us this evening, who painted the beautiful artwork featured on the cover, and our live stream collaborators from the Community Digital Arts Hub, as well as our board of directors. I'd like to express much gratitude to our funders, the Government of Canada's Canada Book Fund, the Canada Council for the Arts, SODEC, and the Conseil des Arts de Montréal, as well as our advertisers. We have a great event for you lined up this evening with readings by three amazing writers featured in the issue: Frankie Barnet, Nour Abi-Nakhoul, and Nora Loreto. Woo! Yes. Thank you to Andreas from Paragraph Bookstore for providing the book sales for sale this evening. Please pick up a copy if you haven't already. The authors will be available for signings after the readings. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our editor, Malcolm Fraser.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Let's try that again. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out. And thank you to this amazing place for hosting the event. It's really nice to be here in a classy, cozy, and cool environment. Some of you may remember our air conditioning free summer launch last summer. That was a little rough. Anyway, yeah, we have a great new issue. The cover art by Peter Krause is amazing. We have some MRB heavy hitters here: founding editor Kimberly Bourgeois, longtime editor Ian McGillis. They both have pieces in the new issue. I also wanted to shout out, Rebecca mentioned our great associate editor Nived Dharmaraj and associate publisher Alexander Swinney. They both have great reviews in the new issue. So anyway, check it out, pass it on, enjoy it. So without further ado, I think we'll get into our readings. I see Frankie is there bouncing an unruly customer. Are we gonna bounce that guy? Can we? It's a double entendre there, but anyway, Frankie Barnet is the author of An Indoor Kind of Girl and Kim, a Novel Idea. She has an MFA from Syracuse University and lives in Montreal. And her new novel, Mood Swings, is out and available right here. So please join me in welcoming Frankie Barnet. I think she may need a moment for this handover.
I would love to sit.
Sure.
Great. Is this okay? All right. Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. So this is my novel Mood Swings that Malcolm mentioned, and I'm going to be reading from almost the exact middle of the book, which felt like a bold choice because I usually would read the opening or something about the main characters, and this is a section about a character who pretty much only appears in this section, but it's the last part of the novel that I wrote, and I wrote it about a year ago when I had my son, who you all know. And it was sort of my nightmare that I wasn't expecting to still be working on the edits of the book after he was born, but it just happened that way that I was. And obviously I've been reflecting on that time because his birthday's coming up, and it ended up being such a special, beautiful time to be able to work on the book with him, with me. And then, so this is one of the sections that I wrote, and it is about one of the characters' mothers. And I really felt like I was able to connect with her because I had just become a mom. So right, I mean, like I said, it's thematically similar to the rest of the book, but because it's one of the characters' backstories is about his mother, so there's nothing really that you need to know. So I'll dive right in. Ricky's mother saw no shame in believing everything she heard. God had a plan for us all. One must light candles on the full moon. Whenever a bird flew in through a window, it was a sign of either prosperity or doom, depending on the season. Wind was a road for fairies. Why not? Someone had to be right. To her, it was quantitative. For example, Jesus Christ was the Son of God who healed lepers and turned water into wine before dying on behalf of the whole world. But he was also just some guy who lived in Palestine a long time ago. Stefan Maeve knew that most people were more than one thing. Her father, for example, had once employed half the town as a general manager of the sawmill, been named godfather to no less than 15 kids, and coached the Little League baseball team to victory in the state championship. But greatness faded. In America, at least, it had a lifespan. The mill closed, and there was so little work that her father and some of his friends had maimed themselves to collect the money from their accidental death and dismemberment insurance policies. By the time Stefan was born, he had one eye and a stump for a right hand. Most people knew him as a drunk who slept all the time.
These two versions of her father taught her that the truth was not one thin line to be tight-roped across perilously. It was a woven network of contradictions that could, if you let it, provide safety. And thus she kept her menstrual blood in a vial around her neck for good luck. She kept her menstrual blood in a glass jar and served it drop by drop to a boy at school to get him to like her back. She fed her menstrual blood to the jade plant on her windowsill to cleanse the night air of bad dreams. Hers was a shitty town to be from. The humidity warped you. Are you the girl whose one-handed father has been asleep for 20 years? People sometimes ask Stefan. He's not asleep all the time, she'd say. He gets up to use the bathroom. Her mother read palms and rented out a tanning bed she'd inherited from a great aunt. You have borrowed meridians, she was always telling Stefan, with no further explanation. Stefan had a feeling it meant she would die young. Her family had a feeble dog that had no name. When they'd moved into the unit, he'd just been there, shivering in his own piss in the bathroom. Sometimes she called him George Michael in her head. Most of the time she hated him because he was ugly and represented everything about her life. When she was 15, a rich man built a hotel that glittered on the shoreline like a movie. All the older brothers and sisters from the neighborhood applied for jobs, but only the most attractive were selected. Stefan often fantasized about becoming a girl who wore seashells on her breast while serving tourists candy-colored drinks by the outdoor pool. But as a redhead with no eyebrows, she was doubtful about her qualifications. A day in the sun left her skin bright pink, and though her breasts had developed years ahead of her classmates, they'd brought with them a thick waist and heavy thighs. Still, one could dream of clocking in and out at the tallest building in town. Such was the reckless hope of youth. She and her friends snuck into the hotel pool almost every day that summer, cooling off on the striped lounge chairs and talking shit about the tourists. Some of the girls their age weren't even pretty. When you're rich, you don't have to be, her friend Danica said. Her friend Helena snorted. They're still girls, just lazy is all. I'd be lazy too if I was rich, Stefan said. You are lazy, said Danica. You still have the Cheeto dust from yesterday under your fingernails. They howled with laughter. It was on a day like this that Stefan had needed to pee. Why didn't she just go in the water like a normal person? That was the first clue that something monumental was afoot. How she was compelled to go inside the hotel. With its grand fountain of a dolphin embracing a sea turtle, the lobby was too beautiful to resist exploring. Fresh macaroons and pineapples were laid out on a platter by the coffee machine. Beyond that, a desk that said concierge. Stefan tried to pronounce the word in her head. She walked past the restrooms entirely and stepped into an elevator just to see what it was like. When I work here, she thought, still dressed in her string bikini and flip-flops, I'll get to pretend I'm on vacation. She pressed the button for the top floor for no discernible reason other than it was what she felt called to do. Sometimes when Stefan felt pulled in various directions, she believed it was her father's phantom hand guiding her along. Other times she knew her father was no more than a drunk who stunk up the bathroom. Exiting the elevator, she found herself on a narrow landing leading to an open blue door. Stefan peered inside and saw a man walking towards her. She knew who he was. Everyone did. He was the richest man in town. She'd seen him in magazines at the grocery store and on the local news. He said in interviews that he built his hotel to connect people with nature. There's nothing like the view of the ocean from one of my penthouses. Are you lost? He asked Stefan. No, she said, looking up at his heavy eyebrows. She could tell he was drunk, but not in the way her father got drunk because this man was happy. He showed all his teeth when he smiled, even the ones on the bottom. You look familiar, he said. Does your father work for me? She shook her head. My father only has one hand. He started to laugh. Yes, it was funny, wasn't it? It was the first time a man had ever looked at her, just her. She was alone on the top floor, far away from her friends, and he led her into a room with a shag carpet and a panoramic view. His heavy gold rings hit the glasses as he made them both drinks. Stefan's went down like a potion. She felt her whole body tingle, like she herself reflected the ocean from all her surfaces. Roderick Maeve was born in the middle of a thunderstorm. Stephane's father rose from his slumber, resting the baby precariously on his lap, and nodded his passive approval. Her mother examined the baby's hands and said breathlessly that she had never seen such strong meridians. Though the child bore his father's heavy eyebrows, Stephane never told anyone about what happened between her and the rich man in the hotel. She knew no one would believe her. Stories like that, there would be layers to the disbelief, an intricate structure, underground tunnels. Besides, no matter where the baby came from, he was so perfect it terrified her. His tiny hands, the gassy smiles she swore were genuine. It was too much, looking at him at her breast and thinking about all the horrible things this life entailed. Shame, bad TV, eating around the mold. One day he would grow up and know what it was to be trash. One day he would have pubes and be no different from all the guys around here, Huey from the gas station or the new mayor with his butt chin and recent embezzlement scandal. All those years to come, they terrified her. Sometimes she put the baby in her handbag just to catch her breath. How could she have been so cruel as to bring him into this mess? Dark thoughts consumed her. The only thing that calmed Stephane's nerves was something from a book she'd read years before. It had said that all great spirits lived multiple lifetimes. Moses, Abraham Lincoln, and Gandhi were all examples. They occupied the bodies of otherwise mediocre people to enact change and fight for what was right. Then, when their flesh died, the spirits traversed decades to find a new host and once more direct the world as their divine wisdom dictated. Stephane had always thought her father could have been one of these men, at least the version of himself from before he lost his hand, generous and hardworking, a true patriarch of the community. But for whatever reason, the Great Spirit had changed its mind and left his body, leaving her father deflated and without purpose. Now the honor would befall her son. It was obvious by looking at the baby. He would lead a special life. He would be remarkable. Surely, crazier things had happened. When the baby was 8 months old, she asked him point blank, "How many times have you been alive before?" The baby merely blinked, but he had this way of blinking. Stephane had never been very good at explaining things. She was more of a tactile learner. A breeze came in through the curtains and tickled her elbows. "Who's going to save the world from mommy?" "Me," said the baby. It was Roderick Maeve's first ever word. Thank you.
Thank you, Frankie. Yeah, and be sure to stick around, everyone, because our featured authors will be here to answer your questions briefly after the readings. Our next reader, Nour Abi-Nakhoul, is a writer, editor, and researcher from Toronto whose writing has gained her a cult following online. Her reporting, opinions, criticism, and content have appeared in a variety of Canadian and American publications, including New York Magazine, Toronto Life, Chatelaine, Catapult, among others. And she's currently the editor-in-chief of Maisonneuve Magazine. She lives in Montreal, and her first novel is Supplication. It's available here at this very event. Please welcome Nour Abi-Nakhoul to the stage.
Yeah, this is good. Hello. Thanks for coming out. I'm gonna keep this. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. I'm gonna keep this kind of brief. I just recovered from COVID a couple days ago. Have you guys heard of this illness? So I have limited lung capacity. This is my book, Supplication. It came out in May. And it's my first book. I'm gonna read a little bit of it, like closer to the end. I don't think I'll give you really context because it doesn't really matter with this kind of book. I guess I will say it is like about a woman who undergoes kind of an extreme act of violence, like towards the beginning, and then throughout the book is navigating this surreal world, trying to find meaning for her life, and undergoing kind of existential and spiritual explorations. Um, so I'll just jump into it. I fell backward into the emptiness in between all things, backward into the place that is the dream of the desire to keep everything apart. As I fell, the force of that desire was wrapping itself around me tightly, a thick muscular coil of serpent, whose strong grip I felt deep in my bones, crushing me totally, crushing me so that it could take me and rebuild me. Under its grip, I relaxed, my muscles releasing softly, giving myself up to it. Everything around me was hazy and uncertain and yet familiar. I hadn't been there before, but the place had always been with me, hiding in the walls, hiding beneath the ground, hiding under my fingernails, concealed inside of me. The veins of that place crisscrossed through all things, hidden like a mining shaft beneath the surface of the world, beneath the surface of our minds and bodies, behind the curtain that sits next to the world stage. Peel back the veneer and it's right there, as obvious as anything else, more obvious than anything else, more real than the dirt or the soil or the plastic, than the gases diffusing over our heads, than the enormous ball of light hovering in the sky and diligently burning itself alive. All these things, in spite of their solidity and their powerful presence, still bend dutifully to the will of this emptiness. Everything on earth and beyond it prostrates itself before the dream that upholds the separateness of all things, the dream of not being touched, of not touching. All hands fold themselves into prayer before it. All hands clasp themselves in reverence to it. There is nothing realer than it. It is the highest thing, higher even than violence. It is the highest violence. When I became accustomed and the haze dissipated, I could see that inside that place was whiteness, similar to the ubiquitous whiteness in the hospital, but not exactly the same. It wasn't fluorescent and glossy. It was matte and dull like the shell of an egg, a slight hint of yellow-green lurking underneath that made it nauseating, that made my eyes swim and dance with the threat of sickness. What would there be underneath the shell? If I scraped at the white, if I cracked it open, what could I find within? But I couldn't reach out and touch the white because I couldn't locate the confines of the room at all, couldn't trace a wall or a ceiling or a horizon. When I looked out, it was like the white went on forever, in every direction. It overwhelmed my senses, making my mind stagger and give up trying to orient itself. The only aspect of the place I could be certain about was that there was a floor, not only because my feet were planted firmly on it, but because I could see the person a short distance away from me, sitting cross-legged on it. But I couldn't find any source of light that was enabling me to see this, to see my feet on the ground and my hands in front of me, and the man sitting there. Everything shone brightly, but without a lamp, without a sun. It shone from some internal source, like the bioluminescence of a deep-sea creature, as though the whole place was a living organism, shining with its own sentient power. I knelt down and placed my hands against the floor, spreading the fingers out carefully, and it was hard and cool like marble. I lowered my body, rolling my legs in front of me and crossing them to mimic the man across from me, and stared at him without fear or even curiosity. I felt that I already knew him, better than perhaps anyone else. The man sitting in front of me was emaciated, his ribs and collarbone jutting out of his skin, the bottom of his rib cage dramatic against the hollow of his gut. Thin folds of skin drooped across his skeletal hands, thin folds of skin drooped across his tendon and vein-webbed neck. Long hair, dark, dull, and fragile, dropped from his head down his back, with strands falling across his chest and collecting on his lap. His legs, like his arms, were long and thin and insect-like, with frail feet folded underneath them. The dry, cracked lips on his face were slightly parted. His eyes were closed and lightly fluttering, as though from a bad dream. His smooth, hairless face was slim and feminine, and nearly healthy-looking in comparison with the gauntness of his body, with bright, even skin. He was muttering something to himself quietly in an endless stream, but no words came out, nothing I could hear. On the left side of his chest, between the nipple and the bottom of the rib cage, there was a hole, a narrow slit that was several inches wide. Its edges were smooth and even with the skin, not red and raw as though it were a wound or a scar. It was as though it was a natural feature of his body. Liquid was streaming out of the slit, a black, thick substance flowing evenly and unendingly down into his lap, splashing across the floor and moving across it like a stream. I stood up from the floor easily, my body not aching or tired, and moved to follow the flow of the muck, the river that cut through the overbearing whiteness. My steps were careful as I walked along the side of the stream, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the white floor, muffled so that I couldn't hear them at all, despite the hard marble-like surface of the grounds. But I could hear the thick trickling flow of the ooze, gurgling and frothing and bubbling, the eager, lively murmurings of liquid in motion. I followed it as it traveled across the ground, my body strong and light, but my mind heavy and slow, like I was peacefully underwater. When I had walked for just a few minutes, the stream suddenly ended. There is a circular gap in the ground, clean cut and perfectly round like an ice fishing hole, around the size of my hands. The black, thick substance flowed straight down into it, all of it falling through the hole down into the depths. I crouched on my hands and knees and, adjusting myself carefully so that I could see around the falling stream, peered down into the hole. Through the hole was a brightness that was brighter than the glow of the white room. I couldn't make out anything at first because of this and blinked hard, squinting until the shock of the glare wore off. On the other side of the hole, the sun was shining with all of its strength, glowing fiery and hot, bearing down with ferocity, with severity, as though trying to ignite the flat landscape beneath it. The ground underneath the terribly bright sun was covered in weeds and grass, a mosaic of patches that were scorched dead yellow and trembling or that were lively green. And standing in the midst of these patches was a horse, bending its long alien snout down over the mess of vegetation. Its gentle, leathery snout with nostrils like gaping caves carved in stone, nostrils carved into the massive boulder of its head. Lining its sad eyes were whiskery, tender lashes, the large dark pupils sitting behind them like giant glimmering marbles, and suspended in the pupils were gloom and melancholy, and hovering starkly, frighteningly behind the gloom and melancholy were timidity and intelligence. The impossible mass of the animal's body was ancient and visceral, both a part of the world and alien to it. The body wrapped in the slick, oily brown-black of its coat, its hues shifting subtly as the horse moved. Behind the body, its tail flicked fitfully against the air, and across the muscular neck was a line of flowing hair, dark and shining and human-like. Between the horse's torso and the ground, its legs stood in the grass like weapons, bony, gnarled staffs encoded with the thread of their strength and virility, of their speed. The animal was beautiful in a terrible, sad way, completely innocent. I was looking out at it through a hole in the wall, looking horizontally across the landscape instead of down onto it through a hole in the sky, as I should have been. The dark substance was flowing out through the hole, around my eye, down the wall and across the landscape where it gurgled in the weeds, seeped into the soil, puddled in the dirt, staining the green and yellow and brown field with black oil. In the distance, the horse stepped cautiously through the brush on its sturdy legs, lowering its neck and sniffing at the green parts, raising its head and gazing disaffectedly toward the horizon, not noticing me as I looked out at it, not noticing as the substance streamed through the hole. Okay, that's all I'm gonna read. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So our third and final reader of the night is Nora Loreto. Nora is a freelance writer and editor at the Canadian Association of Labor Media. She co-hosts the popular political podcast Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. The author of 4 books, Nora lives in Quebec City, and her book, The Social Safety Net, it's not even out yet, but you can get it here. Please welcome Nora Loreto.
That's right. If you want to sell it for $45, you can do that, because that is surge pricing. And you're going to learn about capitalism in this book. Wow. Thank you so much, Nour and Frankie. I mean, I listened to your readings and I'm thinking like maybe some of us in this room, all of our fiction that is hiding on our computers and loose leaf papers around our apartments. And never going to see the light of day, but maybe someday. But I take the coward's path and write nonfiction. I'm kidding. Nonfiction is really fun. And so this is quite a different book. This is a series with the extraordinarily cheery title, Canada in Decline. Indigo wasn't super happy with that. They thought it was a bit too negative. But as I say, it's a series. And so this is the first book in this series. It's called The Social Safety Net, and it sets the table for the conversation of why everything seems to suck right now. Okay, so it's not super optimistic. It's not super uplifting, but in our sorrow, we can make dark jokes, right? Yes, please, yes. Let's be, whatever. Decline can be fun, right? We can fiddle while Rome burns. So as Malcolm said, this book is not even out yet. It comes out in August, and by a miracle of miracles, this came out in time for tonight. And the second book is already written. So don't ask me too many questions about this book because I don't remember it. The second book comes out in May 2025, and it is about the corporate control of Canada. So these are supposed to be smaller books, taking a chunk at a time, explaining this overall decline. And as a coward, I will be starting with the introduction because I didn't know if I should launch into provincial and territorial austerity trends. That's a great chapter, by the way. St. Patrick's Day, Quebec City, 1985. The St. Lawrence is still frozen over, though water breaks through in areas closer to the shore. The majestic river looks like winter, with big chunks of ice sticking out above its surface, calling for an ice canoe to be run across it by a team of intrepid canotières à glace. We're lucky to still have this much ice cover by St. Patrick's Day today. On top of the cliff that holds up La Haute-Ville, and on the same block as St. Patrick's High School and St. Patrick's Church, a grand chorus closes out a gala on stage of Quebec City's largest theater, Le Grand Théâtre. They sing the classic American song When Irish Eyes Are Smiling in front of a wooden set of an interior of a house. Just before the curtain drops, four honored guests slip away from their balcony to appear on stage at the back of the set. They walk down the stairs of the theater set to join the front row of the chorus, performing their alliance, their collective colonial origins. Brian Mulrooney and Ronald Reagan, flanked by their wives Mila and Nancy, sing along. Brian is given the pleasure of soloing the last line, which he warbles with confidence but little sense of tone. Sure, they steal your heart away. That's how it sounds like in the video. It's very bad. The line is repeated, and the quartet, alongside the rest of the performers, hold the last note. Green and white balloons fall from the rafters onto the crowd. Two Irishmen, descendants of a mass migration of people fleeing poverty, now find themselves at the top of the political world, singing in front of a fake country home. Their unified voices, singing a song of Irish diaspora pride that American politicians have belted out from Warsaw to China's Great Wall, are showing all of North America that the chill between Canada and the United States that marked the Pierre Trudeau era is a thing of the past. The gala is the media highlight of what would be dubbed the Shamrock Summit, and the summit marks a turning point in Canada's history. It isn't just that Canada's Prime Minister will enjoy a few years of warm relations with his American counterpart, or that both countries are now led by men of Irish descent. The summit lands in the middle of a decade of massive change. Behind it is a post-war period when a version of Canada in which settler Canadians took tremendous pride was built. Ahead of it are decades of undoing much of what was built in the previous 40 years. Reagan had already laid out his plans to transform the United States, but Mulrooney is still green. He was elected not even 7 months earlier in a historic landslide, but the wheels of change have already been set in motion. The year is 1985. The year 1985 is as close to the end of the Second World War as it is to the 2025 federal election. Think about that. Whoa. The 40 years that came before 1985 and the 40 years that have come after have been radically different. The social, economic, and political differences of these two eras created two separate Canadas, one that grew in the shadow of two world wars and economic depression, and another that has gradually unwound everything that was built from post-war prosperity. I was born in 1984, in the middle of this 80-year chunk. It was that year that Mulrooney was elected and that Orwell imagined as the future in his famous novel, near the upper end of what would eventually be called the millennial generation. When I hear the sound of Brian Mulroney's voice, honestly, it soothes me, as if I'm sitting in earshot of the TV in a high chair, hearing him speak during the midday news show or watching CBC's Midday. While I was raised in the shadow of the 1970s and 1980s, the only Canada I have ever known was deeply influenced by the man who brought neoliberalism to Canada, our Margaret Thatcher, but Irish, our Ronald Reagan, but Canadian. The transition from the post-war welfare state period to present-day Canada has been a decline. Under the cover of financial crises, Mulroney introduced neoliberalism to Canada through tax cuts, spending cuts, and free trade, and the slide has never stopped. Indeed, we could argue that it has actually accelerated. A decline is a continual loss of something, whether that be strength, power, numbers, quality, or, as the Canadian Oxford Dictionary says, vigor, deterioration. Regardless of where one sits on the political spectrum, the notion of decline shades the discussion of every issue. From housing, we used to have affordable housing and now we don't, to education. Education used to be higher quality, but now kids are being shortchanged. From healthcare, we used to be able to rely on the public healthcare system, but now we can't. To whatever else. Why doesn't anything work? We talk about this moment as if we have accepted that Canada is in decline, regardless of whether or not we use that word. But where did this decline come from? And does decline mask a darker truth? Was Canada ever great to begin with? Indeed, decline is not the perfect word to describe a settler colonial state that has never achieved a state of justice or truth, especially about itself. But the post-war period did bring about prosperity that was used for the first time to create better lives for Canadians beyond the ruling class. However, the spoils of that prosperity were not shared equally, and as the welfare state and its social safety net started to fall apart, Canada had two options. We could have expanded the net and shared even more of that prosperity, giving coverage to people who had been intentionally left out, or we could have snipped at the net itself, transforming not only what people could access from state services, but also what they believed they should receive from the state. The latter process was how neoliberalism came to Canada. In Chile, it came with bombs. In the UK, it came with police violence against striking miners. In Canada, it arrived through smiling politicians singing Irish songs and through promises that actually, no, nothing would be made worse. We would all, in fact, live much better. To understand our particular decline, we must go back to the start, right to Canada's early colonial origins, and proceed through the evolution of the colonies into provinces united through our current federation. Many of the reasons why our decline looks the way it does can be explained by moments in our past, and not just moments from the mid-1980s. From Canada's early origins through the post-war period and the dawn of neoliberalism, the country's status quo, the character of any given moment in which Canadians find themselves, has been constantly evolving, improving especially for the elite. At the same time, it's been devolving for everyone else, especially over the last 40 years. Neoliberalism is an economic, political, and social theory that shifts power away from collectives of people and towards financial markets. It derives from liberalism, the classic notion of the free individual and laissez-faire economics that places faith in the markets to regulate themselves, and then remixes liberalism to place markets themselves at the center of everything, our economy, our politics, and our society. Neoliberalism was a reaction to Keynesianism, the economic philosophy of John Maynard Keynes, which guided the creation of what Canadians call their welfare state. The 20th century French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu describes neoliberalism like this: the movement towards the neoliberal utopia of a pure and perfect market is made possible by the politics of financial deregulation. And it is achieved through the transformative and, it must be said, destructive action of all the political measures that aim to call into question any and all collective structures that could serve as an obstacle to the logic of the pure market. The nation, whose space to maneuver continuously decreases, work groups, for example, through the individualization of salaries and of careers as a function of individual competences, with the consequent atomization of workers, collectives for the defense of rights of workers, unions, associations, cooperatives, even the family, which loses part of its control over consumption through the constitution of markets by age groups. Policies are implemented to consolidate this financial power, as citizens are told directly and indirectly that the most important unit in society is the balance sheet, not a life. Under neoliberalism, anything that the elites believe stands in the way of the markets and their pursuit of profits is seen as a threat that needs to be neutralized. From radical feminists to conservative church ladies, any group that organizes collective action is de facto an enemy of the neoliberal economic order. Every time a union insists that a company make work safer, or that workers should be paid more, or that corporations should pay for their workers' pensions, these groups, unions and workers, become enemies of this new economic order. And so, slowly, the economic order based on Keynes's theories have transformed from one that took collective care to one that specifically seeks to destroy our notion that community exists and that we need it. Margaret Thatcher sought to break the miners' strike in 1984 because the union posed an existential threat to her project to convince the world that there is no such thing as society. In 1987, Thatcher said this in an interview: "I think we've gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it's the government's job to cope with it. Or I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I am homeless, the government must house me. And so who are they casting their problems on? Society. And who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first." For Thatcher, society isn't all of us together collectively. By existing, society poses a threat, not just to government itself, even though very technically government is just the organized expression of any society, but also to the market. Community doesn't just make it harder for neoliberalism to operate. Community poses an existential threat to neoliberalism. Society as democracy poses a threat, and voters must be neutralized. If democracy reigns in capitalism by confronting and tempering market forces, this system must find ways to disenfranchise and confuse potential voters. When democracy is diluted from a collective force to an individual one, it ends up serving capitalism because average people have been told that there is no such thing as society, and we don't have a community around us to confirm otherwise. There is no us, there is just me. And the useful thing about this formulation is that it's extremely difficult for me to take on the market or political decision that I dislike, or to stop a project that might destroy my community. Individual boycotts don't work. No single person has the power to take down a powerful corporation on their own. The only thing that has ever worked is people acting together. I'm gonna skip ahead to the last 2 pages of this chapter. Who could have known that this is where we would be thanks to events like the Shamrock Summit, held near blocks from where I write these words? The joyful, carefree singing of When Irish Eyes Are Smiling in a city that still rushes out to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, despite the fact that only 10 men in the entire city were born in Ireland, and I know 20% of them personally, reminds us that telling people a truth can be far more powerful than telling people the truth. A truth would be that our friendship with the United States is mutually beneficial to both countries. A truth would be that Mulrooney could not pay endless amounts of money on social programs. But the truth is much different. While we can wrap ourselves in truths that aren't actually borne out in our daily lives, the people in power know very well that a truth, regardless of how untrue it might be, can be a powerful political tool. They just need to find the right formula to turn a truth into the truth. And they have done it. They have convinced us that neoliberalism is our way forward. Back in 2004, culture critic Harry Giroux warned that neoliberalism in the United States was already producing deadly and scary consequences. Neoliberalism fostered the conditions to create and legitimize, quote, the central tendencies of proto-fascism, unquote, wrote Giroux. Carroll explained that these conditions, quote, range across the corporatization of civil society, the mobilization of a fearful nationalism, the rise of an Orwellian newspeak that impairs the capacity of the American public to think critically, the broad militarization of culture, and tellingly, the reduction of the state in its repressive functions. Carroll and Giroux were both writing at the turn of the 21st century, more than 2 decades into the neoliberal experiment. Militarized police, increasing secrecy from within government, and even greater use of force against poor communities all herald a rising fascism that has been easy for some to ignore. But some of us saw it long before the rise in violence against transgender people, before the trucker convoy took over downtown Ottawa, before the United We Roll campaign, before the pledge to create a barbaric cultural practices hotline, before any of these things reared their heads in the mainstream. And it is here that we need to stop this decline. And it is here that the need to stop this decline is so obvious and so imperative. During the Shamrock Summit, a journalist asked Ronald Reagan if he had the chance to sample some quote unquote Canadian salmon. Mulrooney jumped in to answer, quote, "At lunch, smoked salmon." He paused, small portions, because we have a serious financial problem to deal with, unquote. Mulrooney added, his Irish eyes smiling. He held back a chuckle, then turned and shared it with Reagan. The Pacific Salmon Treaty came into force that same day, so salmon was an obvious pick. Though was it Pacific salmon or Atlantic salmon? Rhetorically, it didn't matter. Mulrooney, indulgent but not too indulgent, was broadcasting for the cameras make-believe thrift over a lunch that he didn't pay for to an audience of Canadians who did pay for their lunches and who would catch this clip on the evening news. Mulrooney's lighthearted comment about the need for thrift would be echoed by politicians of all political stripes at all levels of government and in all regions of Canada over and over. The false allyship, this "we're all in it together" approach, would become the dominant way in which politicians talk about the public policy, finances, and markets. Folksy, lighthearted, but serious as well. Mulrooney's quote-unquote serious financial problem was the excuse to set in motion the beginning of the neoliberal transformation of Canadian politics and the country's economy and society. And it has proceeded slowly enough that while some of us have noticed, most Canadians only feel the effects of a policy years after it's been introduced, just like those of us who live along the St. Lawrence notice less and less ice covering the mighty river each year.
Thank you, Nora. Nora, stick around, and I'd like to invite Nour and Frankie up to answer any questions you might have. Thank you, Nora. I'll start with you since you're here and you were just reading. I thought your book was really powerful. Really scorching, very intelligent, with a lot of humor. But you joked about this off the top, but I did feel kind of bummed out by it.
Sorry, man.
That's
why we've got music.
Yeah, it's true. There's the past is horrible. The present is precarious. The future is doubtful. So I would ask, where do we find optimism in this scenario?
Here, honestly, the fact that there's a freaking newspaper that's still being published that's big, right? I'm not being trite. The last chapter does go through what we need to think about and how to get ourselves out of this mess. And my goal with this book is to try and bring sense to this feeling that everything is fucked and we don't know why and we can't unfuck it. And the answer how to do all this stuff is in the past. We have done amazing things. People mobilizing together have done amazing things in Canadian history. Every single thing that is good about our society is because people came together and mobilized. And we need to get out of the paradigm that our salvation is related to, the political system. People need to build community and fight for new kinds of organizing in local communities that can actually bring services and support and hope to people. And also to find funny things. If you watch the Shamrock Summit, I found it very funny. I watched that video probably 30 times. And it's hilarious to watch these people dance and sing like they're clowns. So you got to find those moments of humor and know that we are all feeling the same thing. And that isolation, I think, the second we break through it is is the spice of life. It's coming together here. It's hanging out. It's the conversations that we'll have later on. It's listening to amazing fiction and reading amazing fiction and arts and culture. And it's the stuff that I think that you're all probably engaged in that does give you a lot of pleasure and optimism about the future.
Thank you. I feel better now. Nour, I wanted to ask you, I was reading your book late at night before going to bed, and it was as I was sort of slipping into sleepiness, I found that it had a nightmarish quality. I mean, there's a dream logic to it that reminded me of some of my favorite storytellers like Haruki Murakami or David Lynch. But I'm curious. It's a very it's terrifying and gripping, and it's there's an abstraction to it. I was a bit surprised because I knew your work previously more as a journalist, and I know you work as an editor. In those domains, you have to be quite logical, and I was curious how you balanced those two vibes as you balance those two aspects of your writing.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. I think like I've always been very interested in things like surrealism and horror and these kind of methods of getting at ideas in more like indirect ways. So they're like can be quite visceral and emotional and like communicate different meanings and different ideas in a way that is not like purely logical. I do, yeah, work as an editor for like a literary journalism magazine, which is quite different. But I do feel like working at that magazine and also in more journalistic work has kind of taught me how to do stories in a more like logical, structured way, and like knowing the forms of storytelling and like the kind of formulas of it and all of the concrete elements you need in order to communicate a story properly has helped me kind of know how to experiment outside of that form and to kind of move around it in like a more effective way. So I do see them as kind of helping each other out in that way a bit. Yeah.
Cool. Frankie, I wanted to ask you. I mean, I loved your book, and I was again, I was reading late at night, and I love books with short chapters, because you can just you don't have to figure out how long you're gonna go for, or like where you have to stop when there's. But at the same time, I kept saying, oh, I'll just read one more. Oh, I'll just read a little more. Oh, this chapter's so short. I'll just read one more. And I ended up staying up too late. But I was curious how that structure came together. Was that always part of the plan, or did it just come out in the writing?
I think it came out pretty naturally. I'm trying to remember. I don't know. But yes, I mean, so the book is also like it's organized in like short sub chapters with like longer chapters. So yeah, I mean, I was conscious of the fact that there's a lot going on in the book and that there's like this crazy premise and there's a lot of ideas. So kind of similar to what you're saying. I mean, anyways, it resonated with me. It's different, obviously. But I was very conscious about how I was going to use this structure to be able to ground the reader a little bit within all this crazy stuff going on. I thought, how can I convince them to keep turning the page and to kind of bear with me a little bit as I tie everything together?
Yeah, well, I think it was very successful because this didn't come across as much in your reading, but the book is very thematically and narratively ambitious, and yet very easy to digest at the same time. So it's a good combination. I want to open up the floor to people here as well as any folks watching at home. Let's hear your question. So for anyone who didn't hear the question, or any folks watching at home, the question was, how does surging and ebbing pessimism affect your work, or where does optimism come in? Where's the balance between the two in your writing process? Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So folks might be aware that my last book was about COVID, right? Which was like super pessimistic and like really, really hard to write. And the way that I approached this book, it is an act of optimism for me to try and push for social change. Like if I was so pessimistic about the state of Canada, I would open a corner store and just stare at my balance sheet all day, like, which is a fine way to live life. Like that's a totally reasonable way to live your life. But I do believe that we can change this. I believe in democracy. I believe in socialism, and I think that socialism can inspire people to do things that might not be in the very square box of socialism. But we have to understand what the heck has gone on before. And the world that we live in right now erases memory and erases history like all the time, and everything is a first, and everything's never happened before, and it's unprecedented times. And oh my God, no other society has ever thought that they were the last generation to live, until you realize like literally every generation thinks that they're the last generation to live, because that's human like nature. And so the optimism for me is in pushing people to realize, oh, this was an intentional project to pull people's power, democratic power, out of our systems and replace that power with corporate power. We can read that as pessimism because it's pessimistic, but that's also reality. And so I want to inject like, but here's how we fight against it. And that's where the optimism is. And to just dream of better days, like in talking about decline, I think the implicit comment next, the implicit callback is, how do we stop decline? Decline is bad. We want to now be in incline. We want to turn this around. And I hope to provide some of the like insights and some tools and some history and how we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. Oh, I'm sorry. It's tricky because, I mean, I'm writing fiction. Thank you.
Sorry, this is like so
This is-
awkward, not good.
No, this is great. I love it.
You want to tell me?
I mean, I can also like hold it. Okay.
There you go.
Right. So it's tricky. I think also writing fiction can feel silly and futile, and especially when you're me, when most of what I write no one is ever going to see or care to see. So, I mean, personally, I would say writing is, I mean, an act of optimism just for me personally, and how I can make sense of things. But I think I also try not to be too literal about things, and not to try to not let what's going on right now seep into what I'm working on in a literal way, because I think for fiction then it can kind of, at least the way I do it, can really quickly feel heavy-handed. And I was thinking, listening to your reading the introduction of your book. I mean, it's such a corny thing to say, and I can't believe I'm about to do it. But I think like if there's, I mean, obviously, like, I'm assuming a lot of us here have at least some portion of our lives dedicated to books, and books are art, and it probably feels silly a lot of the time. And I always wonder, like, why couldn't I have done something more practical with my life? And I think it's a valid question. I don't really have an answer to it, and I still often wish I was doing something more immediately helpful. But I do think that, from my own experiences, I've had experiences with art and books where it shifts the way we think, and shifts our paradigms, the way, in Nora's introduction, this call for a new way of thinking, and thinking beyond the structures we have at hand. So I would say with that, I approach my writing with that lofty ideal in mind.
Yeah, that's so true. I feel like writing fiction is really silly. Like,
Yeah.
just sitting in your room and just writing stories is like one of the silliest things you could possibly do. But it's serious business also. I feel like, forgot what I was gonna say. I feel like in my book that sort of, it is very pessimistic in a sense. It's nihilistic. I mean, it's a horror novel, but most of you have not read my book, so I guess the protagonist is kind of navigating the world, repeatedly trying to find some system of meaning to like imbue upon her reality, and she's like over and over again trying to do that, and it's not very successful, because that sort of thing is rarely successful. So I feel like that kind of thing is quite pessimistic in a sense, but you can also look at it in a more optimistic tone. Like, it is beautiful that we do that as humans, and repeatedly searching for meaning even when it's futile. It can be an optimistic search as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? I think we're going deep here, but I'd love it if there was more than one question from the audience. Don't be shy.
Like, what's that thing that's beeping?
Yeah.
Right. What is it?
Yeah, can we? Oh, we've got a question here.
Or an answer.
I have a question for Nora. How much is Canada actually in decline? So how many books will you be publishing on this topic?
Right.
But I guess the other question kind of we'll leave it at that. How fucked are we?
How much is Canada really in decline, or how fucked are we?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question, because now I'm going to contractually bind. Do you want me to answer and then you can ask that?
Well, then it's part of it, yeah. So the follow-up was how much does sort of the state of what you're talking about, like, how does the international factor into all of it? Because to talk about all these things on a national level is one thing, but the international aspect makes something seem extremely hard.
And so the follow-up was, how does the international aspect fit into?
Like when we're talking about
Societal decline.
societal decline and politics.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to answer your question by contractually obliging my publisher to give me 4 books in the series, because the short answer is there are 2 contracted books with a 3rd book that is like pretty much going to happen. So the next book is The Corporate Control of Canada, and that's where we get into the international question. So I'll answer that in a sec. That book is already finished. I submitted the manuscript on June 1st. And so honestly, if you ask me any questions about this, I actually don't know. I have no recollection of writing this book. And the book after that, fingers crossed, but like it's a 75%, not a 20%, like gonna happen, is on the democratic decline of Canada. So what's happened with our democratic institutions. If you all buy 10 books, the 4th book will be The Security State. So next book is coming out in May 2025, and then the democracy book has to wait for the next federal election. So we're in a bit of a holding pattern, because I was actually contracted to do the democracy book, and then I was like, I'm not doing that. I got to do the corporation book. So what is the role of the international law of this? That is the $1 million question, and I get into it far more in the 2nd book on how free trade fundamentally changed everything in Canada. Free trade truly changed everything. And we're in a world right now where it's like, oh, we're renegotiating CUMSA or NAFTA or whatever we want to call it. It's no big deal. We'll get some better worker protections or whatever. And it's not controversial. But if you look at the struggles in the 1980s and the 1990s over free trade, that was the moment where Canada really jumped all in to throwing ourselves to the international markets. And in throwing ourselves to the international markets, we massively divested our own sovereignty and ability to change things, because we are at the whim of international markets. So one example of that, I'm sorry, this is like a freaking lecture, right? It's like, okay, so pensions in Canada, the public pensions, in 1993, public pensions were funded at 95% Canadian investments. In the 1987, the government changed it to allow pensions to be invested anywhere, and now less than a third of our pension money is invested in Canada. So if you're wondering what the crisis of productivity and investment in business in Canada, we are not investing in Canada because it is way more lucrative to make 10%, 13, 15% returns off of investing in a mine in wherever the hell than to actually invest in Canadian companies. And the result of that is that we've monetized our pensions such that, oh, the pensions are making 10% returns, whereas before they would be even, right? We pay out what we pay in, but people are making lots of money off of it. The future of this is the decline of American hegemony. And that is anyone's guess how that goes. The BRICS bloc, considering going back to a gold standard, is like totally going to be globally disruptive. And Canada, as evidenced by what our support for what the United States and Israel is doing in this kind of package of garbage, is that we're all in on that as well. And so it's actually not good. We're on the wrong side of the global order. And the good news is that if we organize locally, we might be able to protect ourselves from some of those shocks.
All right, a lot to take in there.
I mean, like, sorry, I just like to. It's like trauma dumping, but like for politics.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions? I have another question for Nour. Did you set out to write a horror novel, or did it come out that way in the process?
Yeah, I did set out to write a horror novel. I was really interested in horror when I started writing the book. Not so much anymore. I feel like I'm done with it now. I mean, as you were saying, it's a bit nightmarish, and I feel like it was doubly so for me because I was writing it. So I'm moving on now to something less scary. But yeah.
Cool. And talking about genre, Frankie, you're again, I felt like this wasn't totally communicated in the excerpt you read, but it's a kind of a science fiction novel, and yet it's in the sense that it's set in a sort of multiply dystopian future. But you're looking at me like that's not.
No, I'm looking at you like I don't know what I'm gonna say next, or like it's hard to describe, I guess.
Yeah, no, but I mean it's set in a future that could be tomorrow,
Right.
You give or take a few major global events, but it feels very contemporary. I wonder. I'm not sure if I can articulate my question, but it felt like. Sometimes when you read science fiction, it feels like there's a lot put into the world building, and not to say that there wasn't in your book, but it felt very like the dialogue and the characters and the situations felt very contemporary and like easing the reader in. So I was wondering, was that intentional, or did that just come out in the process?
I think intentional insofar as I really don't enjoy reading a lot of world building, so I don't enjoy writing it. So it wasn't something I was interested in doing. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to kind of deconstruct what my thought process was, but I know, and it's not like to disparage things that are more along on like the genre side, but I was really not really not interested in doing that, and I wanted it to feel as normal as possible. I mean, and to kind of fill in the blanks, like the premise of the novel is that all of the animals on Earth are dead, and then there's like this billionaire figure who is promising to build a time machine to like go back to before like everything got all fucked up. So and it's like not like in my head and in my fiction brain, because that is not so crazy to me. Like it feels kind of plausible. Yeah.
Totally. And I love the simplicity with which you set it up. Some people might take pages and pages where you just say, one day the animals all die.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to give the assembled audience, as well as anyone who might be watching from home, the opportunity to ask a question. I won't belabor the point. No pressure, but this is a special opportunity, to ask your questions. So there's a question for all three writers, which is, how did you tackle history?
Yeah, I feel like I did not. There is no history in the book. I mean, my book is written in a way where there aren't really like concrete markers like that. Like it is all over the course of one day. There are characters, but they do not have names. They don't have attributes, not even the protagonist. And I wanted to my intention was to really immerse the reader in the like consciousness of the protagonist and how she is thinking and feeling and navigating the world. And I feel like things like concrete markers like times and places and names would have distracted from that. So I really excluded it from the world of the novel.
I think for me, I mean, something that I was thinking about a lot when I was writing the book, and I still think about, immediately I'm like, I feel like my novel is so hyper present, hyper contemporary in a way that's almost off-putting that I wish it wasn't, and I feel, but if I were to like talk myself up, I would say it's maybe indicative of the moment we're living in when we are so hyper focused on the present and we don't really have that. I mean, I guess I'm speaking for myself, but have as much connection to the past and to our history as we could. And I think so I was aware that my characters were living with that sensibility. And that's what I would say.
Yeah, okay, so for me, it was a battle with history. I set out to talk about the post-war period, and you cannot talk about the post-war period without talking about the war period, without talking about the pre-war period, without talking about the pre-Canada period. And when we're talking about social services especially, you cannot write a progressive critique of society without looking at how social services were used as colonizing, genocidal tools. So I found myself like backing up, right? So I thought Mulrooney was a really great anchor for like this paradigm shift for what we experience today. But as I was writing, I was like, oh my God, I have to back up to like the Filles de Roi and be like, the only reason why white Quebec society exists was because they needed women to do it with these men and produce 700 and however many women. And boom, that's 8% of the population today, which is like actually crazy in Quebec, right? And so all of a sudden you're going back and thinking, okay, so how did social services, charity, the difference between French Canada and English Canada, like huge differences in understanding the poor. The first chapter talks about poor auctions in St. John's, Halifax, and St. John. So like people would put, like poor people would be on auction and you would be like, I'm going to pay you 10 cents to break these rocks, and someone's like, I'm going to pay you 11 cents to break these rocks. And it's like, okay, I'm going with that guy. Like people would buy them in these poor auctions. Other kinds of poor kind of things that were being done in the colonies was to literally break rocks or to make roads or to live in these asylums where you couldn't work, you were able-bodied, like good luck, get out. And looking at how social services in English Canada emerged from that model versus French Canada, where it was like, everyone is worthy if they are practicing Catholic. And it completely changes how social services form in both societies. So I was fighting history throughout the entire book, and I got to the last chapter and I'm like, what is the present? And I would write the status quo, the status quo, the status quo. My editor was like, why do you keep saying the status quo? What does that even mean? And it's like, oh Christ, okay, so I've got to get that out of my language and got to, talk about like the present, even though the book doesn't come out for another year, and what is the present, and maybe we'll be a nuclear war. So yeah, history in Canada is everything, is all consuming, is overwhelming, is overbearing. And the most written about history in Canada is from Confederation to about World War I. And a lot of history written from World War I to the 1980s, and then we pretty much stopped. And today, I mean, history books are really, really rare. Like, you know, it's just not in the same way that it was in the past. And I think that that is just so fascinating. So, yeah, and I read a lot of Royal Commissions. A lot of the Royal Commission on the MacDonald Commission, 1,200 pages. It's so interesting. It's so good.
Thank you for taking one for the team.
Oh, I'll do it again.
I'm going to give one more opportunity for a question if anyone wants to ask one. Going once, going twice. Nour Abi-Nakhoul, Frankie Barnet, Nora, Loreto, thank you so much for coming and having this discussion, the wonderful readings. Thank you all for being here. And be sure to pick up a book at the, yes, or all three. At the Paragraph
yours.
Books table over there. The authors will be here to sign your book. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, no, it's like, pick up what? No, straight across, come on.
Yeah.